Fight!
Fatal Tornado. Use it. Now, in all seriousness, let's talk about DPS. We're going to use Partisan as the example just because I've noticed floating around the YouTube, there's a weird way in which people are looking at Partisan, primarily on DPS, which is fine to a degree, but in this video, we're going to focus on why you want to be careful of using DPS to assess things like damage rotations and the best damage or attacks to use. I've noticed this question a lot. What's the best damage rotation for Partisan? And you're going to get a lot of different answers, but the answer I'm going to give you is it depends on the situation. It depends on the enemy that you're fighting. And for you to really understand which is the best rotation, you really have to understand how your tools work and how they react or relate to the opponent that you're using them on. I will say, just to kind of get out of the way because I don't want to focus on this, when you're thinking about down damage or when a target is downed, whether that's a stun or an elemental down, there's all this talk about which is the best Partisan damage rotation to use. I'm going to be completely honest with you. If you really want to optimize your damage and you can use Partisan, that means you can use Sword. And you're probably better off using Street Caliber. When you look at the damage, when you look at its potential, its potency, there's no reason of having that conversation. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I know you're technically not being a Partisan main, but if you're really serious about getting that damage in when an enemy is downed, just use Sword and then swap back when he's not down. First, let's take a quick look at what I mean, and then we'll get down into a breakdown and analysis of how using DPS versus just looking at potency and really understanding enemy attack patterns could be at your detriment in a lot of situations. To get a better understanding of what I'm talking about, let's look at the frame count on a couple of attack patterns full on. So what we're going to see is how many frames you have within an attack sequence. And then we're going to break down how many frames you actually have in between each attack to get a better understanding of how you need to think about your attacks, specifically which Partisan attack is better than another. As we can see, there's about 439 frames from the start of the first attack and the end of the last attack. So I started the counter once I parried that first attack. What I want to direct your attention to is the time between the first attack and the second attack. "95 frames. What is important about these 95 frames? Well, let's go back to our Partisan frame data. And what do we see? Other than a very weak uncharged cleave and a 2-hit thrusting javelin, there's nothing that's going to fit within that attack window. Now in this example, I'm using the Partisan weapon action to guard, which is about 30 frames. And so if we do 30 minus 95 or 95 minus 30, that gives us 65 frames. So what that does allow me to do is use a charged Photon art if I'm not going to attack or counter that first strike. When we look at the second attack that is followed up by the third attack, which is a flip kick, we end at 265 frames. 265 minus 90 gives us 170 frames. So if we're to look at our frame data, we can fit in a charged Cleaving Scythe. We cannot fit in a charged Fatal Tornado. Now you might be thinking, okay, then I should be using charged Cleaving Scythe in this attack window. But let's do a potency check to make sure that we're not falling fallacy to the DPS mistakes that you can easily make. Once again, a 2-hit thrusting javelin, 93 frames. So that can fit in between the frame count of the first and second attack. In addition, a 2-hit javelin is 455 potency. With 93 frames, we have 2 frames to execute an uncharged Fatal Tornado, which is 513 potency. Not to mention, it is only 118 frames, so it as well will fit within the attack window between the second strike and the flip kick. Following those 2 attacks, we can follow up with a charged Assault Buster, which is 480 potency. If we were to add all 3 of these attacks up, regardless if it's Photon Avenged or not, it will give us a base potency of 1,448. Because we cannot use any attack if we wanted to do a charging Cleaving Scythe, and thus countering on the second hit, we could do a charging Cleaving Scythe in addition to an Assault Buster. Its base potency is 1,330. Within that attack window, we're looking at about 118 potency difference. In addition, the Javelin 2 hit into Uncharged Fatal into Assault Buster will net you less frames overall. This can get important because if you're doing something like Wand Partisan, you can potentially fit a Wand parry after the Assault Buster. Now, of course, this is just one example and the situations will change. So what I'd like to do is just go through a couple of more situations in slow motion to see where Cleaving Scythe might not be the best option or something that you might not ever do given the situation, especially when we start thinking about, if I only have the ability to use one attack regardless of its frames, does DPS really matter? Or is it potency? So I've been picking on Cleaving Scythe based on the, not necessarily fallacy, but the potential overbelief that it is the greatest tool, purely based on DPS. Because there's going to be situations to where you can't fit it in, or you can fit it in, but you're going to have to cancel it halfway through. And if you remember, an uncharged Fatal Tornado, based on potency, is stronger than the first half of a charged Cleaving Scythe. We've also shown that if you're able to counter effectively, using Cleaving Scythe can reduce your damage potential because you are leaving attacks out and able to get that initial charge off. What I also want to point your attention to is what happens when your positioning on Cleaving Scythe isn't ideal, and how that is also going to modulate your actual DPS. So in this first example, I'm going to show you the ideal situation against Nogleth where you would use a charged Cleaving Scythe, where it is going to hit for its max potential. What we want to pay attention to is where both strikes land. And when we look at the next situation, this is the minimal distance, and compare where both strikes land when it's at the ideal distance versus when you are too close. Notice where the first strike lands and where the damage number appears. The second strike hits Nogleth further back. You can also see that the damage numbers are also further away from you or from the player. What's happening here is that unlike the ideal distance where both strikes hit the core or the top of the head, in this situation, the first strike hits the head, the second strike actually targets the left paw or the left foot. I wanted to quickly call this out to get a better understanding of how Cleaving Scythe works and things that you're going to have to be careful of and recognize that the DPS charts is not going to have these specific interactions and mechanics listed. This is where it's very, very important to understand the weapon, understand your position, understand the situation, and determine what is the best attack or what is the best damage rotation given that knowledge. And so speaking of knowledge, let's go through some of the more effective, I won't necessarily say optimal, but they're up there, attacks with Partisan that you can use to respond to Nogleth and its attacks. Now, these are just a couple of examples. Of course, the situation, your positioning, especially if there's things like rocks in the way, are going to change that. But that's something you're going to want to work on when you're determining which attack do I need to use or do I want to use with Partisan or any weapon. Same rules apply more or less, but Partisan does require a little higher amount of specificity. Speaking of specificity and timing, there is something that can help you, and this flew a bit under the radar. And I didn't pick up on it until I was doing all of this research and experimentation, and that is how to adequately use Assault Buster. Now, you might have already picked up on this, but what we are seeing is after you use a Photon art, you have what seems to be about 70 frames before you have to initiate Assault Charge. This becomes very important because when we think about enemy attack patterns, what's coming next? How much time do I have to do something? Assault Buster does not have to be used immediately. You have a little bit more than a second to assess the situation and figure out, should I charge Assault Buster or should I cancel it and go into another Photon art to get a Photon art Avenge? And then when I do have the time to charge it, using it. It's also important to realize that if we look back at our frame data, based on potency, Assault Buster is weaker than our other attacks. So this is very, very important, and I'll show you what it looks like when you blow past that time window. Now, yes, I know this probably wasn't the most definitive answer many of you were looking for, but this is kind of the name of the game when it comes to Partisan and probably some other weapons if you dig deep enough and you really want to see what is the quote-unquote best damage. You know, it's really going to come down to really understanding the weapon, understanding the mechanics within the attacks of these weapons, and then also recognizing the situations in which they're most beneficial. Really, the purpose of this video, I wanted to make sure we understood that DPS is very helpful. It can be a very strong foundational principle to build your weapon proficiency, but we should not stop there. Really understanding that at the end of the day, we are trying to do damage, and DPS is not necessarily the most damage. We still need to look at potency and figure out how do we fit those high potency attacks such as Charge, Fatal Tornado, which to some degree gets a bad rep, and I'll admit early on I overlooked it as well, but making sure that we can either prevent that from happening or catch it quickly. Other than that, hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching. If you have any other questions, of course, leave them in the comments and we'll go from there. And until next time.